Now, just finally, let me say something about how the kind of layout of these villages also really becomes part of the essence of what Luddism is about. I said to you that I wasn't entirely convinced with the traditional argument that Nottinghamshire Luddism was somehow moderate. I think it depends where you look. I think that Luddism in Nottingham itself was a much more ordered, targeted, selected operation, but in the villages you have got evidence of much more violence being used. We've already seen instances of guns being used, guns being fired. There are a small number of instances when masters are shot and killed by knitters. Blows are often exchanged. Property is destroyed. I mean, none of these things, it seems to me, add up to village Luddites being rather orderly and moderate individuals. I think they hold their own against their West Riding and Lancashire counterparts when we look at the villages. So, as I say, residents held at gunpoint, hosiers were sent threatening letters, police and soldiers were threatened and attacked, a number of highway robberies were committed in the name of Ned Ludd, often again at gun or hatchet point. And as one of the county magistrates, William Sherbrooke of Southall, informed the Duke of Newcastle in November 1811, contributions are levied round the county under the influence of menaces to the lives and property of individuals. And again, he relates to Newcastle, the mob is so organised that nothing but military placed in every parish will be adequate to suppress it. Newcastle himself informed the Home Office that, quote, people are never safe in their homes and robberies and some attempts to murder are constantly taking place. Indeed, Newcastle continued, I am of opinion that the present state of the county is calculated to excite the most nervous apprehensions for the consequences which may avail. You always have to make allowances for local figures like that overreacting. But there is, again, quite a lot of evidence of violence of Luddism. I don't think it is all in their paranoid minds. So, let me try and wrap this up into some form of conclusion. Just before I do that, I'm just going to give you a bit more evidence of this point about Luddism being a rural movement. Let me start back at the beginning. What do we notice about this Luddite here? Cross-dressing. Cross-dressing, again, there's a long-established tradition of this in English folk culture, though I haven't found much evidence of this happening in Nottinghamshire. It seems that men dressing as women was more of an affair in Lancashire and West Riding, although I did notice on the great website that's been done by the Luddite Bicentenary people that there was a food riot in Nottingham Marketplace about 200 years ago, almost to the week, in which Lady Ludd made an appearance. The use of disguises, especially blackening of faces, by those who doled out ritual punishments to those who had offended communal norms, and levying contributions on the community. Again, these are all long-established activities in English folk culture. I think there is evidence to suggest that Luddites were aware of these traditions. Frame-breaking recommenced at Bulwell on Mischief Night, the 4th of November 1811, a night long associated with popular revelry. But absences, I think, can be just as telling as well. When Shrove Tuesday came about in February 1812, the authorities were struck by the absence of the usual festivities that took place. Connaught and Baker, the two Bow Street runners who'd been sent up to Nottingham to bring some kind of order to the place, wrote back and said to the Home Office that Shrove Tuesday has by long custom been a day in which the common people collected themselves together in great numbers and indulged in violent and boisterous sports, especially about the forest. By refusing to participate in this calendric riot, the community was sending a message, it seems to me, to the authorities of just how desperate the times were. I'm also struck by the Luddites' use of humour. Understandably, not an aspect that much has been said about, because we are talking about a serious movement. A movement, of course, that becomes a capital offence if you get caught by the spring of 1812. You can be executed for breaking frames. But on one occasion, the Luddites were particularly humorous, such as when a party of Luddites from Arnold put the remains of one broken frame in the village stocks, or when Luddites at Basford fastened parts of a broken frame to the roof of the local prison. Both instances, it could be argued, were evidence of Luddites taunting the authorities. Now, I'm not, of course, suggesting that Luddism was merely an extension of all of these fun kind of festive kinds of activities. Of course, they had stepped beyond the bounds of custom in being so violent, but I don't think we can underestimate the kind of cultural work that's being done here. I mentioned to you that it was a group of Luddites who were caught in the act of poaching on Lord Middleton's estate that led to the conviction of James Toll and his conspirators. And I found quite a bit of other evidence, as I've said already, about Luddites being engaged in those kinds of rural survival crimes. Village Luddites, then, were not semi-professional criminals divorced from the wider community, an argument put forward famously by Malcolm Thomas, who says, by the time of later Luddism, Luddites are essentially contractors, because it's now such a dangerous crime that a small band of dedicated framework knitters are being paid to do this, because it's simply too dangerous for others to do it. I think that criminal element has been there since the very beginning, hence the acts of stealing that accompanied Luddism. Luddite cells, we also know, grew organically from kinship, neighbourhood and trade connections, all of which, again, illustrates that we're dealing with a set of communities that are linked by a number of mechanisms. And I mentioned enclosure as well. One final humorous anecdote. When James Toll writes his confessors, which is recorded by one of the local magistrates, he recalls that one of the ways in which they had tried to put pressure on knitters to join them was, quote, by destroying their potato and onion beds in the night, cutting up their gooseberry and currant bushes, if they have any. Again, sort of evidence that some knitters clearly had plots of land that they used to grow food on. Again, whether enclosure is taking those things away remains to be seen. So, I will conclude now. Previous interpretations of Luddism in Nottinghamshire have shed much light on why Luddism broke out when it did. Thomas is particularly convincing on that. But they have had much less to say about why Luddism assumed the form and geography. For Malcolm Thomas, echoing William Felkin, of course, Nottingham hosier and unrivalled authority on the history of the hosiery trade, hunger and hatred were the causes of Luddism, just as a later group of historians would say hunger and hatred was the cause of Chartism. For E.P. Thompson, it was the final dismantling of the old paternalist framework, the disintegration of the moral economy, that explained the timing, and as he saw it, the character of Luddism. But neither of these interpretations, it seems to me, really explain the character of Luddism. I've tried to suggest to you that Luddism in Nottinghamshire was about more than a mere wage dispute, as Malcolm Thomas says, or the latest, albeit more dramatic episode in the history of trade or trades unionism, another way that some historians have said Luddism was simply trades unionism that got out of hand. It was a more violent, deviant kind of episode of trade unionism. To understand the character of Nottinghamshire Luddism, it needs situating in the context of rural protest and the strategies of everyday resistance, not radical politics or insurrectionary activity. Machine breaking was part of a well-established pattern of survival crime, and what Roger Wells has famously termed covert social protest, which brought the knitters into conflict not only with their employers, but also with the local squirearchy and the forces of law and order. Whether Nottinghamshire Luddism represented an important moment in the emergence of a working class consciousness is, I think, a question that we'll never really be able to satisfactorily answer. Much of what I've had to say, like much recent work on the history of protest, has focused on community, in this case the knitting villagers, but I do not share the interpretation of some historians that Luddism was somehow parochial. At the other end of the extreme, I don't agree that it was an extra-communal movement either. The links that Luddites in Nottinghamshire had with Luddites in the West Riding and Lancashire were very weak. Despite the limited efforts of Henson, the village knitters participated very little in the national campaign to secure parliamentary protection for the framework knitters. And as I've said, I don't think we should judge them too harshly there. They had good reason for not paying much attention to that campaign. And those that did participate were drawn from the higher paid, finer branches of the hosiery trade. If anything, Luddism in Nottinghamshire was an intercommunal movement. But it does not follow that Luddism was a cross-class movement. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I haven't found any evidence of other groups from outside the working class making up the faces of the Luddite crowd. In a telling concluding section of one of his many letters written to the Home Office, the Duke of Newcastle confessed the following: "I think I can do more good with a very intelligent, active and determined set of men in the middle class of life than with those who are in a higher station. These people have already rendered essential service, and I sanguinely hope will yet do something still more essential. Luddism had undoubtedly given a unity of purpose to the propertied classes, if only because it had frightened them so much. The community, then, it seems, could also be the crucible for class conflict.